Service and Sentimentality. By Amaritta Beane. No unauthorized reproductions allowed. All rights reserved to the author. No inspirations for characters drawn from real-life individuals, no resemblance to real individuals intended. Service and Sentimentality. First edition October 6, 2021. Copyright 2021 Amaritta Beane. Written by Amaritta Beane. Service and Sentimentality. By Amaritta Beane. It is a matter little disputed, that a rich young man moving into a new neighborhood is swiftly marked down as lawful prey, by all the young ladies of said neighborhood. Still less is the matter argued, that on leasing a fine mansion in the area, such a young man will have a great need of staffing his new house with all manner of maids, cooks, gardeners and upper servants. A fine young man cannot tend to his own needs, not even a man possessed of 2 sisters. Thus it was that Mrs. Bennet arrived home in a state of the greatest excitement, upon receiving the latest item of tittle-tattle from her friend Lady Lucas. Not to the Bennets' former home at Longbourn, of course. That was long since lost, let out at rental in order to support the family after Mr. Bennet's disastrously quixotic tilt upon the exchange. She returned, rather, to a tumble-down and rather disreputable little cottage on the furthest boundary of the village of Longbourn. The Bennet family had settled there after the great crash and readjustment of their financial affairs, and with it their social standing. A dreadful come-down it had been, to be sure, from a landed estate, even if an entailed one, and that a crying shame in itself, to a dwelling once considered fit for a labourer, or at best a small holder or tenant farmer of small and undemanding family. But the Bennets' brood was not small, indeed. 5 girls is a fine family, in better circumstances. Only add a son to the pot, and 5 girls might be accounted a fine family indeed, and let the entail go hang. A son might not have cured the Bennets' immediate problems, true. Such a disaster could not be solved merely by production of an heir to the estate. But in the long term, the income from the property would have remained at least in the family hands, staving off penury and guaranteeing them the tattered remnants of gentility. But Mrs. Bennet's womb had not obliged, and sinless Mr. Bennet remained. And when he was gone, so would the money from the estate rents evaporate, and with it all means of support for Mrs. Bennet and her girls. A sad world. A sad, sordid world indeed, and money the implacable engine driving it. And indeed, the same implacable engine driving Mrs. Bennet, as she flung the creaking cottage gate open, and hurried down the garden path. Around the back of the house, and through the kitchen garden she wended her way. The garden was planted to within an inch of its life with everything edible, medicinal and useful that might be imagined. And the chickens were pecking about in it to find wormy and spidery sustenance as they might, hot mash being a luxury, now, rarely accorded them. All of that went to the old pig being fattened up, in the tiny field attached to the cottage. In better times she might have encountered Peggy, the family's last remaining servitor, hanging out laundry or picking time for a toddy for Mr. Bennet. One last servant, the Bennets' last thread of a claim to being merely gentlefolk in somewhat reduced circumstances, not finally and irrevocably descended into the petty bourgeoisie, or still worse, the peasantry. But Peggy's mother had fallen sick these 3 months past. After posting off to take care of her, Peggy had finally sent word to say that she wouldn't be returning, and who could blame the faithful old girl? The stipend the Bennets had been able to spare her had been lean indeed, these past few years. This defection had been followed by earnest debate, could they afford to take on a new housemaid? And the final verdict being, despite Mrs. Bennet's mutinous and unruly protests, that, most certainly, they could not. Servantless they were left, bereft, denuded of assistance in keeping the household ticking over. And quite without a pretension to gentility left in the world. An ordinary working family, indeed, lacking only the remunerative work that would have confirmed their status finally. Urgency is a thing that can clarify the mind to a wonderful degree. And certainly for Mrs. Bennet, this final buffeting thump in the Bennet family's downward descent in social status had made something clear. For a fair few years now, she had been in a condition of indignant denial, refusing to admit the seriousness of their financial affairs' deterioration, or the necessity of examining efficacious but disagreeable solutions. But now, and over the past few days, Mrs. Bennet was a changed woman. No possible solution was too outre for her consideration, and anything bringing in money to the household was worth considering as a solution. True, they were not indigent, as yet. Mr Bennet lived and breathed, and the entail was not yet a matter monstrously looming upon their doorstep. And yet, 5 daughters. A number that might make a strong man blench, and a nervy fusspot of a woman near to go off her head, when it comes to thinking of how to raise them and support them. The clothes. The food. The education. For the Bennets' slide down the social ladder had been gradual, barring the last disastrous bump. Many had been the expensive music lesson shelled out for, the Italian master or highly recommended governess hired, along the way. One never knew what accomplishment might prove to be crucial, in securing the attentions and addresses of an eligible party. But now, for the first time, marriage was not the foremost matter in Mrs. Bennet's mind, in relation to her girls. For sure, if one or more of them could procure a solvent suitor, it would be a great blessing. But the matter of their immediate outgoings was too pressing, the lack of long-term financial security too inarguable, for marriage to be relied upon as an answer. It was too chancy, too much subject to the winds of fate. More certain means of securing funds were necessary. Raising more livestock, perhaps? Or turning their few sinewy, underfed bantams into a thriving pot fowl and egg business. Mary, indeed, as the most expensively educated of the girls, finally allowing the Bennets to reap a return on their investment, by searching out employment as governess or village schoolteacher. Such prime appointments did not make themselves available on a regular basis, however, and more humble, less remunerative positions must be considered in the meantime. Anything even vaguely resembling respectable paid employment, in fact, was liable at this point to be seriously entertained by Mrs. Bennet. Beggars couldn't be choosers, after all. And, while not precisely beggars as yet, drastic measures must yet be taken to prevent their ever entering upon that penurious and precarious state. It was a peculiarly focused and energetic Mrs. Bennet, then, who hustled chickens out of her way, en route to the kitchen door, and impatiently brushed drying herbs aside, as she entered the cottage kitchen. The sight that met her eyes there was of her 3 elder daughters, each occupied in her own way. Mary was working upon a text with the aid of a Greek primer at the kitchen table, a less idle and unprofitable pastime than it might at first seem, since the vicar of the parish had made a project of a learned and scholarly archaic work of philosophy, and was sometimes of a mind to pay Mary a few shillings for correcting and refining his work, and making her own suggestions for editing and further expansions upon the theme. Jane, dear and lovely Jane, a smile always upon her sweet lips even in their straitened circumstances. Dash was sewing by the fireplace. A shawl about her shoulders, for they could not afford a roaring blaze early in the autumn, when an extra layer or 2 might do the job instead. Jane was a fine and accomplished seamstress, and in times gone by the work in her hands might have been an elaborate sampler, or a bonnet fit for the head of a lady of fashion. Today, she was darning stockings, a great pile of them, dropped one by one as they were completed into the cotton laundry bag beside her, and some of them being stitched at for the 3rd or 4th time, lumpy with reworkings. Waste not, want not. Lizzy, that's much too thick. You're throwing half the turnips away. Mrs. Bennet said sharply. These, her first words upon stepping through the doorway, were directed at her second daughter. For Elizabeth Bennet, second child of moderately educated, formerly well-to-do gentlefolk, was standing at the kitchen table with her dress sleeves pushed up high, her hair pulled back and her face a little pinkened. She was engaged in peeling a great pile of root vegetables for the evening stew, a set of pastry pie cases set out on the marble rolling board beside her. Her forearms worked with the labor of it, still quite narrow and pale, a gentlewoman's limbs. But not quite as narrow and pale as they had been the year before, and still less the year before that, and her gown plain and serviceable besides. Both her arms and her face were a little browned, in fact, from working out in the garden, and feeding the pig in the field. She had acquired a little heft, a little muscle doing it, and while not unbecoming, it was also not quite ladylike. In short, if any guest, upon setting foot in the kitchen, had been introduced to Elizabeth as the family serving girl, he would have let it pass without comment. She could still pass for a lady, certainly, and yet the matter was by no means a foregone conclusion. In any case, there are worse tragedies in the world, and while not smiling, there was humor in her face, as she replied to her mother. "Fear not, ma'am, at least, Hogberta the pig will eat well tonight." And she pressed on with her labor, as her mother huffed and puffed and set down various packages, not pleased in the least by her daughter's wit.
Will you take a dish of tea?